A Gunman's Wedding Vow. Alessia DeSantis had never believed in love. Not in their world. But when her father was murdered, when she was forced into a marriage she did not choose, she realized something brutal. This was not a wedding. This was a cage. Marcello Ricci watched her in silence, then finally smiled. "You need a husband," he murmured. "And lucky for you, I've always liked breaking pretty things." Chapter 1. The Scent of Blood and Roses. The air in the cathedral hung heavy, a suffocating blend of incense, wilting roses, and the metallic tang of fear. Alessia DeSantis stood at the altar, not as a bride radiating joy, but as a pawn in a game far older and more brutal than she could have ever imagined. Her ivory dress, a masterpiece of delicate lace and intricate beadwork, felt like a shroud, the train a chain binding her to a fate she hadn't chosen. The scent of the roses, meant to be celebratory, was tainted, forever associated in her mind with the crimson stain that had bloomed on her father's white shirt just weeks before. She hadn't seen her father's body. Her brothers, stony-faced and tight-lipped, had shielded her from the gruesome sight, but the whispers had reached her, carried on the wind that snaked through the ancient, crumbling walls of their family villa. A single shot. Clean. Professional. The words echoed in her mind, a chilling counterpoint to the soaring organ music that filled the cavernous space. Her father, Don Antonio DeSantis, had been a pillar of their community, a man of respect, feared and revered in equal measure. He had ruled their small corner of Sicily with an iron fist encased in a velvet glove. Now, that glove lay empty, and Alessia, his only daughter, was the price of peace. The price of a fragile alliance forged in the wake of a sudden, violent death. She glanced at the man beside her, Marcello Ricci. He was a stranger, yet terrifyingly familiar. She had seen him only a handful of times before today, always at a distance, a shadow lurking at the edges of her father's gatherings. He was strikingly handsome, in a dangerous, predatory way. His dark hair, slicked back from his forehead, accentuated the sharp angles of his face, the intensity of his dark, almost black, eyes. Eyes that seemed to see through her, stripping away the carefully constructed facade of composure she had erected. He was older than her, perhaps by 15 years, his face etched with the lines of experience, of hard-won battles and unspoken sorrows. A faint scar bisected his left eyebrow, a silent testament to a life lived on the edge. He wore a tailored black suit that molded to his powerful frame, the fabric whispering with every subtle movement. He exuded an aura of controlled power, a coiled spring ready to unleash at any moment. The priest's voice droned on, reciting the ancient vows, words that should have been filled with hope and promise, but in this context, felt like a death sentence. Alessia's hands, clasped tightly in front of her, were clammy and cold. She felt a tremor run through her, a wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm her. She focused on a single point in the distance, a stained glass window depicting a fallen angel, its wings broken and bloodied. A fitting symbol, she thought bitterly. Marcello's hand, large and warm, covered hers. It wasn't a comforting gesture, but a possessive one. A brand. She flinched, but he didn't release her. His grip tightened, a subtle warning, a reminder of the power he now held over her. She had tried to fight it, of course. The arranged marriage, the sudden upheaval of her life. She had pleaded with her brothers, with her aunt, the only mother figure she had ever known since her own mother had died when she was a child. But their faces had remained impassive, their answers curt and unyielding. "It is for the good of the family, Alessia. It is your duty." Duty. A word that had been drilled into her since birth. Duty to the family, duty to the famiglia. A word that now tasted like ashes in her mouth. The ceremony ended. The priest pronounced them husband and wife. Marcello turned to her, his dark eyes gleaming with something that sent a shiver of dread down her spine. It wasn't love, or even lust. It was something colder, more calculating. A predator assessing its prey. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You need a husband," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. The words were deceptively simple, yet the underlying threat was unmistakable. Then a slow, chilling smile spread across his lips. "And lucky for you, I've always liked breaking pretty things." The reception was a lavish affair, held in the sprawling gardens of the Ricci estate. Fairy lights twinkled in the ancient olive trees, casting an ethereal glow on the assembled guests. Laughter and music filled the air, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within Alessia. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting congratulations with a forced smile, her eyes constantly searching for an escape, a way out of this gilded cage. She saw her brothers, standing together, their faces unreadable. They were part of this, complicit in her imprisonment. She felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment that threatened to consume her. But beneath the anger, there was a deep, aching sadness. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time in her life. Later, as the night wore on, Marcello led her to a secluded balcony overlooking the moonlit sea. The air was cooler here, a welcome respite from the stifling atmosphere of the reception. The scent of the sea, salty and wild, mingled with the lingering fragrance of Marcello's cologne, a dark, musky scent that both repelled and intrigued her. He stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. She could feel the heat of his body, the subtle tension that radiated from him. She stiffened, every instinct screaming at her to pull away, to run. But she was trapped. "You know why we're here, Alessia," he said, his voice low and husky. "This isn't a love match. It's a business arrangement." She turned to face him, her chin lifted in defiance. "I am not a business deal, Signor Ricci." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent another shiver down her spine. "No, cara. You are far more valuable than that. You are the key to peace. The guarantee that your family and mine will no longer be at each other's throats." "And what if I refuse to be that key?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to control it. His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "You have no choice, Alessia. Your father is dead. Your brothers have agreed. You are mine now." He reached out and traced the line of her jaw with a calloused finger. She flinched at his touch, but he didn't stop. "Don't fight me, Alessia. It will only make things harder for you." His words were a threat, but there was something else in his voice, a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. Sadness? Regret? She wasn't sure, but it was enough to make her pause, to wonder if there was more to this man than met the eye. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "Submit," he whispered, "and perhaps, in time, you'll find that this cage is not so unpleasant after all." The words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. Alessia looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the sea, feeling the weight of her new reality pressing down on her. She was trapped, bound by duty and fear. But somewhere, deep within her, a flicker of defiance ignited. She would not be broken. She would not submit. She would find a way to survive, to reclaim her life, even in this world of shadows and blood. She would have her revenge, a vow silently made to the sea, or maybe the feeling of the sea had changed her, and she had a new vow. One thing was certain. Chapter 2. A Cage of Gilded Promises. The drive to the Ricci estate was a silent, suffocating journey. Alessia sat rigidly in the back of the black limousine, staring out the window at the passing landscape. The rolling hills of Sicily, usually a source of comfort and familiarity, now seemed alien and threatening. Every olive tree, every crumbling stone wall, whispered of the life she was leaving behind, the freedom she had lost. Marcello sat beside her, but he might as well have been a ghost. He didn't speak, didn't even glance in her direction. He simply stared straight ahead, his face an impassive mask. The silence was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable weight that pressed down on Alessia, making it difficult to breathe. The Ricci estate was a fortress, a sprawling complex of ancient stone buildings surrounded by high walls and imposing gates. As they drove through the gates, Alessia felt a sense of foreboding, a chilling premonition of what awaited her within. The villa itself was magnificent, a testament to generations of wealth and power. But it felt cold, unwelcoming, a mausoleum rather than a home. Servants, their faces carefully neutral, scurried to and fro, unloading luggage, preparing rooms. Alessia was led to a lavish suite overlooking the gardens, a room that should have been a haven, but felt more like a prison cell. The walls were adorned with priceless artwork. The furniture was antique and exquisitely crafted, but none of it brought her any comfort. She changed out of her wedding dress, the heavy fabric feeling like a physical manifestation of her burden. She put on a simple silk dressing gown, the soft fabric a small comfort against her skin. She stood by the window, looking out at the gardens below. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and perfectly sculpted hedges. The beauty of the scene was jarring, a cruel reminder of the ugliness that lay beneath the surface. A knock on the door startled her. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a young maid, her eyes downcast, her voice barely a whisper. "Signora Ricci, dinner will be served in 1 hour." Alessia nodded, dismissing her with a wave of her hand. She wasn't hungry. The thought of food made her stomach churn. But she knew she had to maintain appearances, to play the role of the dutiful wife. She forced herself to eat, picking at the elaborate dishes that were placed before her. Marcello sat at the head of the long, polished table, his presence dominating the room. He ate with a hearty appetite, seemingly unaffected by the tension that hung heavy in the air. He didn't speak to her during the meal, but his eyes followed her every move. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, every gesture, every expression scrutinized and dissected. She tried to meet his gaze, to project an air of defiance, but her courage faltered under his intense scrutiny. After dinner, he led her to his study, a dimly lit room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and cigar smoke. He gestured for her to sit in one of the leather armchairs, facing the desk. He remained standing, leaning against the edge of the desk, his arms crossed over his chest. "We need to establish some ground rules, Alessia," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. She looked up at him, her chin lifted. "Ground rules? As if I am a child or a pet." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his dark eyes. "You are my wife, Alessia. And in this world, wives obey their husbands." "I am not of this world," she retorted, her voice trembling slightly. "I was not raised to be a subservient ornament." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You will learn, Kara. You will adapt. Or you will break." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I know this is not what you wanted, but it is what is necessary. For both our families." "Necessary?" She scoffed. "You speak of necessity as if it justifies this abduction." "It is not an abduction, Alessia. It is a marriage. A legally binding contract. A contract signed in blood," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He sighed, a hint of weariness in his voice. "Yes, perhaps. But blood is the currency of our world, Alessia. It is what binds us, what protects us." He pushed himself away from the desk and walked towards her. He knelt down in front of her, his eyes level with hers. She flinched, expecting him to touch her, but he didn't. He simply looked at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I am not a monster, Alessia," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "I know this is difficult for you, but I will not mistreat you. I will provide for you, protect you. All I ask in return is your cooperation." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they only served to heighten her fear. Cooperation. It was a euphemism for submission, for obedience, for the complete surrender of her will, her identity. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She felt tears pricking at her eyes, tears of anger, of frustration, of despair. She blinked them back, refusing to show him any weakness. "I will never cooperate," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I will never be your willing prisoner." He stood up, his face hardening. Then you leave me no choice, Alessia. I will have to find other ways to persuade you. He turned and walked towards the door. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, and looked back at her. Sleep well, Kara, he said, his voice laced with a subtle threat. Tomorrow, your education begins. The door closed behind him, leaving Alessia alone in the silence of the study. She sat there for a long time, staring into the darkness, feeling the weight of her gilded cage closing in around her. The promises of protection, of provision, meant nothing. They were just words, empty gestures designed to mask the brutal reality of her situation. She was a prisoner, a pawn in a deadly game, and she had no idea how to escape. But the night felt long. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Ricci Mansion. The first few weeks at the Ricci Mansion were a blur of strained formality and unspoken tension. Alessia moved through her days like a ghost, haunting the opulent rooms and sprawling gardens, her presence barely acknowledged. She was surrounded by servants, but they were silent, efficient shadows, their eyes carefully averted. She felt utterly isolated, a stranger in a strange land. Marcello was a distant, enigmatic figure. He was often absent, away on business that was never explained. When he was present, he treated her with a cold courtesy, a formal politeness that was more chilling than outright hostility. He never touched her, never raised his voice, but his presence filled every room, a constant reminder of her captivity. Alessia spent her days exploring the mansion, trying to find some semblance of normalcy, some escape from the suffocating reality of her situation. She discovered a vast library, filled with ancient tomes and dusty manuscripts. She lost herself in the books, immersing herself in stories of other worlds, other lives. It was a temporary escape, a way to forget, if only for a few hours, the gilded cage that surrounded her. She also spent time in the gardens, wandering among the ancient olive trees and fragrant rose bushes. The beauty of the landscape was a stark contrast to the darkness that she felt inside. She found a small, secluded grotto, hidden away behind a waterfall. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could be alone with her thoughts, her fears, her unspoken longings. One afternoon, she was sitting in the grotto, sketching in a notebook, when she heard a voice.
Signora Ricci.
She looked up, startled. It was one of the older servants, a woman named Emilia. She had been with the Ricci family for decades, and she was the closest thing Alessia had to a confidant, although their interactions were always brief and guarded. Emilia, Alessia said, closing her notebook. What is it? Emilia hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously. I wanted to warn you, Signora. Warn me? About what? Emilia lowered her voice, speaking in a hushed whisper. The mansion, it is not always what it seems. There are shadows here.
Secrets.
Alessia felt a chill run down her spine. Secrets? What kind of secrets? Emilia shook her head. I cannot say, Signora. It is not my place. But be careful. Trust no one. She paused, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. And be especially careful of Don Ricci. He is not always what he seems either. Before Alessia could question her further, Emilia turned and hurried away, disappearing into the shadows of the mansion. Alessia sat there for a long time, Emilia's words echoing in her mind. Shadows. Secrets. Trust no one. What did it all mean? She had already sensed that there was more to the Ricci family, to Marcello, than met the eye. But Emilia's warning had heightened her sense of unease, her feeling of being trapped in a web of intrigue and danger. That evening, Marcello returned from one of his mysterious trips. He seemed different, his usual cold demeanor replaced by a strange restlessness. He paced the drawing room, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in thought. Alessia watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She sensed that something was wrong, that the delicate balance of their uneasy truce was about to be shattered. He stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes dark and unreadable. We have a problem, Alessia, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. A problem? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. What kind of problem? He hesitated, his jaw tightening. There has been a betrayal. Someone within the family has been working with our enemies. Alessia felt a surge of fear, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Enemies? Who? He shook his head. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we are in danger. All of us. He walked towards her, his eyes searching hers. I need your help, Alessia. Her breath caught in her throat. His words were unexpected, a stark contrast to his previous demands for obedience and submission. My help? How can I possibly help you? You are intelligent, observant. You see things that others miss. I need you to be my eyes and ears within the mansion. I need you to help me uncover the traitor. He paused, his gaze intense and unwavering. Can I trust you, Alessia? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. It was a test, a challenge, a chance to prove her loyalty, or to betray him. She looked at him, her mind racing. She hated him, resented him for taking her freedom. But she also recognized the danger, the threat that loomed over them both. And she knew that, for now, their fates were intertwined. You can trust me, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. A flicker of something relief, perhaps crossed his face. He nodded, a slight softening of his hard features. Good, he said. Then we begin tonight. After dinner, I will show you something. Something that will help you understand the complexities of our world. He turned and walked away, leaving Alessia alone with her thoughts. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a player in a deadly game, a game where the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. And she had just made a choice that could either save her or destroy her.
Tonight, another shadow would be cast.
Chapter 4. Whispers of a Forgotten Past. After dinner, Marcello led Alessia through a labyrinth of corridors, deep into the bowels of the ancient mansion. The air grew colder, the silence more profound, broken only by the echo of their footsteps on the stone floors. Alessia felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling of fear at the back of her neck. She had the unsettling feeling that she was descending into a hidden world, a world of secrets and shadows. They reached a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. Marcello produced a large, ornate key from his pocket and unlocked the door. It creaked open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase that led down into darkness. Where are we going? Alessia asked, her voice barely a whisper. To the archives, Marcello replied, his voice equally hushed. A place where the history of the Ricci family is preserved. He gestured for her to precede him down the stairs. Alessia hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She had a strong premonition that she was crossing a threshold, entering a realm from which there might be no return. But she also knew that she had no choice. She had given Marcello her word, and she would not break it. The staircase spiraled down into the depths of the earth. The air grew heavy, laden with the scent of dust and decay. The only light came from the flickering flame of a single torch that Marcello carried. Shadows danced on the walls, creating grotesque shapes that seemed to writhe and twist before her eyes. Finally, they reached the bottom of the stairs. They were in a large, vaulted chamber, lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. The shelves were filled with ancient books, leather-bound ledgers, and dusty scrolls. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and decaying parchment. Marcello placed the torch in a sconce on the wall, illuminating the chamber with a dim, flickering light. He walked over to one of the shelves and pulled out a large, leather-bound book. He opened it, revealing pages filled with elegant script and intricate illustrations. This is the Ricci family chronicle, he said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. It contains the history of our family, from its origins in the 15th century to the present day. He turned the pages, pointing out names, dates, and events. Alessia listened, her eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and dread. She learned of ancient feuds, bloody battles, and secret alliances. She learned of betrayals, assassinations, and vendettas that had spanned generations. Marcello paused at a particular page, his finger tracing a name written in bold script. This is my grandfather, Don Giovanni Ricci, he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of pride and bitterness. He was a powerful man, a ruthless leader. He built the Ricci Empire, but he also made many enemies. He closed the book and looked at Alessia, his eyes dark and troubled. My grandfather was murdered, Alessia. Just like your father. And the man who killed him was never brought to justice. He paused, his jaw tightening. I believe that the betrayal we are facing now is connected to my grandfather's death. That the past is repeating itself. Alessia felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered Emilia's words. The mansion, it is not always what it seems. There are shadows here. Secrets. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcello walked over to a large wooden chest that sat in the center of the chamber. He opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and documents. I want you to study these, he said. I want you to look for clues, for connections. Anything that might shed light on my grandfather's murder and on the current betrayal. He handed her a stack of photographs. She looked at them, her eyes scanning the faces of the men and women who had come before her. She saw faces filled with pride, with ambition, with cruelty. She saw faces that hid secrets, faces that betrayed a darkness that lurked beneath the surface. One photograph caught her attention. It was a picture of a young woman, strikingly beautiful, with long dark hair and piercing blue eyes. She was standing next to a man who Alessia recognized as Marcello's grandfather, Don Giovanni. Who is this? She asked, pointing to the woman. Marcello hesitated, his expression shifting. That was Isabella Rossi. She was a close friend of my grandfather's. Alessia sensed that he was holding something back, that there was more to the story than he was letting on. She looked at the photograph again, studying the woman's face. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at Alessia's memory. She looks familiar, Alessia said, her brow furrowed in thought. Marcello's eyes flickered. Familiar? How so? Alessia shook her head. I don't know. It's just a feeling. She looked closely at the woman, but then saw a faint marking. It was like a crest. She'd seen that before, on a document her father had been studying. That crest, Alessia began. That means a sudden noise interrupted her. A loud crash echoed from the staircase above. Marcello whirled around, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun that he always carried concealed beneath his jacket. Someone's here, he whispered, his eyes narrowed. Stay here. And don't make a sound. He extinguished the torch, plunging the chamber into darkness. Alessia huddled in the corner, her heart pounding in her chest. She heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate. She held her breath, praying that they wouldn't be discovered. The whispers seemed to grow louder, almost like a warning. Chapter 5. The Serpent's Smile. The footsteps drew closer, the sound echoing ominously in the darkness of the archives. Alessia held her breath, her body pressed against the cold stone wall, every muscle tense with fear. She could hear Marcello moving silently, positioning himself near the entrance of the chamber, his gun drawn and ready. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. A moment of silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the frantic beating of Alessia's heart. Then, a voice, deep and gravelly, spoke. Marcello? Are you down there? Relief washed over Alessia, quickly followed by confusion. She recognized the voice. It was Salvatore, Marcello's cousin, and his closest advisor. He was a man of imposing stature, with a cold, calculating demeanor that had always made Alessia uneasy. Marcello lowered his gun, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He relit the torch, the sudden burst of light illuminating the chamber. Salvatore stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Salvatore? What are you doing here? Marcello asked, his voice sharp and suspicious. Salvatore stepped into the chamber, his eyes scanning the room. He saw Alessia huddled in the corner, and a faint smile played on his lips. It was a smile that sent a shiver of dread down Alessia's spine. It was the smile of a serpent, cold and calculating. I was worried about you, Marcello, Salvatore said, his voice smooth and deceptively calm. I saw you come down here, and I followed you. You followed me? Marcello's voice was laced with disbelief.
Why? Salvatore shrugged.
I had a feeling something was not right. And I was right, wasn't I? He gestured towards the open chest, the scattered documents and photographs. You're digging into the past, Marcello. Stirring up old ghosts. I'm looking for answers, Salvatore, Marcello said, his voice tight with anger. Answers that someone is trying to keep hidden. Salvatore's smile widened. Answers? Or are you looking for something else, Marcello? Something more personal? He walked towards Alessia, his eyes fixed on her. She felt a wave of nausea, a primal fear that made her want to shrink away from his gaze. You brought her down here? Salvatore said, his voice dripping with disdain. The DeSantis bride? What are you thinking, Marcello? Alessia is helping me, Marcello said, his voice a low growl. She has a unique perspective. Salvatore chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that echoed in the chamber. A unique perspective? Or a dangerous liability? He stopped in front of Alessia, his eyes boring into hers. She met his gaze, refusing to show him any fear, although her heart was pounding in her chest. You're playing a dangerous game, Signora Ricci, Salvatore said, his voice soft and menacing. You're meddling in affairs that you don't understand. I understand more than you think, Salvatore, Alessia said, her voice surprisingly steady. His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression.
Do you?
I doubt it. You're an outsider, Signora. You don't belong here. He turned back to Marcello, his eyes narrowed. Get rid of her, Marcello. She's a threat to us all. Marcello hesitated, his eyes flickering between Alessia and Salvatore. He was caught in a conflict, torn between his loyalty to his cousin and his growing trust in Alessia. She stays, Marcello said, his voice firm and resolute. She's my wife, and she's under my protection. Salvatore's face contorted with anger. You're making a mistake, Marcello. A fatal mistake. He turned and stormed out of the chamber, his footsteps echoing up the stairs. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, plunging the archives back into darkness. Marcello extinguished the torch, leaving them in silence. Alessia could feel his presence beside her, his body tense and alert. He's the one, Alessia whispered, her voice trembling.
Salvatore.
He's the traitor. Marcello didn't respond. He simply stood there, his breathing heavy and uneven. Alessia sensed that he knew, that he had suspected it all along, but had been unwilling to accept the truth. We need to get out of here, Marcello said, his voice finally breaking the silence. Before he comes back with reinforcements. He grabbed her hand, his grip tight and urgent. He led her back up the winding staircase, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. They reached the top of the stairs and emerged into the dimly lit corridor. Marcello paused, his eyes scanning the hallway. We need to be careful, he whispered. Salvatore will have men watching us. He led her through a maze of back corridors, avoiding the main areas of the mansion. They moved silently, like shadows, their hearts pounding in unison. Finally, they reached a small, inconspicuous door that led to the outside. Marcello opened the door, and they slipped out into the cool night air. They were in a secluded part of the gardens, hidden from view. Alessia looked back at the mansion, its imposing silhouette looming against the night sky. She felt a sense of relief, of having escaped a trap, but she also knew that they were not safe. They were still in danger, hunted by a man who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. She looked over at Marcello. The serpent's smile would be a nightmare she wouldn't be escaping anytime soon. Chapter 6. Beneath the Veil of Duty. They found refuge in a small, abandoned gardener's cottage at the edge of the estate. It was dusty and neglected, but it offered a temporary sanctuary from the immediate danger within the mansion walls. Marcello secured the door and windows, his movements quick and efficient, born of years of experience in navigating perilous situations. Alessia sat on a rickety wooden chair, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The events of the past few hours had shattered her carefully constructed facade of composure, leaving her feeling vulnerable and exposed. She looked at Marcello, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a single oil lamp he had found. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcello sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We need to figure out Salvatore's plan, what he's after,
Who he's working with.
He mentioned my father," Alessia said, her voice trembling. "He said I was meddling in affairs I didn't understand. He implied that my father's death was connected to all of this." Marcello nodded, his eyes dark and troubled.
It is.
"Your father and my grandfather were rivals, but they also had a complicated relationship. There were secrets between them, secrets that Salvatore is now trying to exploit." "What secrets?" Alessia asked, her voice filled with a desperate need to understand. Marcello hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "It's a long story. A story that involves betrayal, forbidden love, and a blood feud that has spanned generations." He walked over to the window, looking out at the darkness. "My grandfather, Don Giovanni, and your father, Antonio, were once close friends. They grew up together, fought side by side. But then something happened, something that drove them apart." He paused, his voice barely audible. "They both fell in love with the same woman." Alessia's breath caught in her throat. She remembered the photograph in the archives, the picture of the beautiful woman with the piercing blue eyes. "Isabella Rossi." "Isabella," she whispered. Marcello nodded. "She was everything. Beautiful, intelligent, passionate. Both my grandfather and your father wanted her. But she chose my grandfather." He turned back to Alessia, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret. "Your father never forgave him. He saw it as a betrayal, a violation of their bond. And he swore revenge. But my father was murdered," Alessia said, her voice trembling. "By someone working for your family." Marcello shook his head. "That's what we were led to believe. But I don't think it's true. I think Salvatore orchestrated both murders, my grandfather's and your father's. He used the old feud as a cover, a way to eliminate his rivals and seize power."
But why?
Alessia asked, her mind reeling. What does he gain from all of this? Marcello's eyes narrowed.
Power. Control.
The Ricci Empire. He wants it all, Alessia. And he'll stop at nothing to get it. He walked over to her, kneeling down in front of her. He took her hands in his grip surprisingly gentle. "I need your help, Alessia," he said, his voice soft and earnest. "I need you to help me expose Salvatore, to bring him to justice. For your father, for my grandfather, for all of us." She looked into his eyes, seeing a vulnerability that she had never seen before. Beneath the cold, hard exterior, beneath the veil of duty and obligation, she saw a man haunted by his past, burdened by the weight of his family's legacy. She felt a stirring of something within her, a connection to this man, this enemy, who was now her only ally. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something more. A shared sense of purpose, a mutual need for justice, for redemption. "I'll help you," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I'll do whatever it takes." He squeezed her hands, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Alessia. I won't forget this." He stood up, releasing her hands. He walked back to the window, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the moon. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice low and cautious. "Salvatore is dangerous. He has eyes and ears everywhere. We can't trust anyone." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of the mansion. "But we have one advantage, Alessia. We know the truth. And the truth is a powerful weapon." The words echoed in the little cottage, the only home she had ever felt in since she stepped foot inside. Chapter 7. Cracks in the Foundation. The next few days were a tense, clandestine dance. Alessia and Marcello, confined to the cramped quarters of the gardener's cottage, worked tirelessly, poring over the documents and photographs from the archives, searching for clues, for any shred of evidence that could expose Salvatore's treachery. They spoke in hushed whispers, their conversations punctuated by long silences, filled with unspoken fears and uncertainties. They shared meager meals, scavenged from the cottage's neglected pantry, their hands often brushing as they reached for the same piece of bread, a fleeting moment of contact that sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through Alessia. She began to see a different side of Marcelo, a side that was hidden beneath the cold, ruthless facade he presented to the world. She saw his intelligence, his sharp wit, his surprising gentleness. She saw the burden he carried, the weight of his family's legacy, the responsibility he felt for protecting those under his command. She also saw his vulnerability, his fear of failure, his deep-seated loneliness. He spoke of his childhood, of growing up in the shadow of his powerful grandfather, of the constant pressure to live up to his family's expectations. He spoke of his arranged marriage to her, of his initial resentment, his determination to break her spirit. "I was wrong about you, Alessia," he admitted one evening, his voice low and filled with regret. "I thought you were just another pampered, spoiled heiress. I didn't see your strength, your intelligence, your fire." Alessia looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of sympathy and something more. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse that he felt for his past actions. "I misjudged you too, Marcelo," she confessed. "I saw you as a monster, a cruel tyrant. I didn't see the man beneath the mask." A silence fell between them, a silence filled with unspoken emotions. Marcelo reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She simply looked at him, her eyes searching his. "We're in this together, Alessia," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "We have to trust each other. We have to rely on each other." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I trust you, Marcelo," she whispered. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration, a spark of something new and unexpected. It was a moment of vulnerability, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of danger and shared adversity. But the moment was shattered by a sudden noise outside the cottage. A twig snapping, a muffled footstep. Marcelo pulled away, his hand instantly reaching for his gun. "Someone's out there," he whispered, his eyes narrowed. They extinguished the lamp, plunging the cottage into darkness. They waited, their hearts pounding in unison, listening for any further sounds. The silence stretched on, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, a voice, faint but recognizable, called out, "Marcelo? Alessia? Are you in there?" Marcelo relaxed slightly, lowering his gun. "It's Emilia," he said, recognizing the servant's voice. He opened the door cautiously, peering out into the darkness. Emilia stood there, her face pale and anxious. "Signor Ricci," she said, her voice trembling. "You must come quickly. There's been trouble at the mansion." "Trouble?" Marcelo asked, his voice sharp and alert. "What kind of trouble?" Emilia wrung her hands nervously. "It's Don Salvatore, Signor. He's consolidating his power. He's arresting anyone loyal to you. He's claiming that you murdered your grandfather and Signora DeSantis' father." Marcelo's face hardened. "He's making his move," he said, his voice grim. "He's trying to seize control of the family." He turned to Alessia, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern. "We need to go back," he said. "We need to stop him." Alessia nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. She knew that they were walking into a trap, that the odds were stacked against them. But she also knew that they had no choice. They had to fight for their families, for their future, for the fragile bond that had begun to form between them. The foundation was cracking, the structure was about to fall. Chapter 8. A glimmer of defiance. They returned to the mansion under the cover of darkness, Emilia leading them through a secret passage that bypassed the main gates and the heavily guarded courtyard. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of foreboding hanging over the estate. The usual bustle of activity was absent, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional bark of a guard dog. "Salvatore has taken over the security," Emilia whispered, her voice trembling with fear. He's replaced all the guards with his own men. He's holding your brothers and your aunt in the East Wing, under heavy guard. Alessia felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards Salvatore for his treachery, for his violation of her family's home. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "We need to find evidence," Marcello said, his voice low and determined. "Something concrete that we can use to expose Salvatore, to prove his guilt." "The archives," Alessia said, remembering the documents and photographs they had left behind. "There might be something there, something we missed." Marcello nodded. "It's a risk, but we have no choice. Emilia, can you lead us there, undetected?" Emilia hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously. I can try, Signor. But Salvatore's men are everywhere."
"It won't be easy."
"We have to try," Alessia said, her voice firm and resolute. "We can't let him win." Emilia nodded, her face pale but determined. She led them through a maze of back corridors, avoiding the main areas of the mansion. They moved silently, like shadows, their hearts pounding in unison. They reached the hidden door leading to the archives. Marcello cautiously opened it, peering down into the darkness. He listened for any sound, any indication that they were being followed. "It seems clear," he whispered. "Let's go." They descended the winding staircase, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. They reached the chamber, and Marcello lit the torch, illuminating the room with a dim, flickering light. Alessia immediately noticed that something was different. The chest containing the documents and photographs was open, its contents scattered across the floor. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice filled with alarm. Marcello knelt down, examining the scattered items. He picked up a photograph, his face hardening. "This is missing," he said, his voice tight with anger. It was a picture of Isabella Rossi, with a letter written by my grandfather, confessing his love for her. "Salvatore," Alessia said, her voice filled with realization. "He took it. He's destroying the evidence." Marcello slammed his fist against the chest, his frustration evident. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice grim. "We need to find something else, something he hasn't found yet." They searched frantically through the remaining documents, their hands trembling with urgency. Alessia found a small, leather-bound diary, hidden away in a corner of the chest. She opened it, her eyes scanning the faded script. It was Isabella Rossi's diary. Alessia began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. She learned of Isabella's love for Giovanni Ricci, of her fear of Antonio DeSantis, of her desperate attempts to escape the escalating conflict between the two men. And then, she found it. A passage, written in a shaky hand, just days before Isabella's disappearance. "Antonio came to me today. He was different. He spoke of a plan, a way to eliminate Giovanni and claim me for himself. He said he had found someone within Giovanni's inner circle who was willing to betray him. Someone who craved power, who resented Giovanni's authority. He wouldn't tell me the name, but he said it was someone close. Someone Giovanni trusted implicitly." Alessia's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Marcello, her eyes wide with understanding. "It's all here," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Isabella's diary. It confirms Salvatore's involvement. It proves that he betrayed your grandfather." Marcello took the diary, his eyes scanning the passage. His face hardened, his jaw clenched with anger. "He killed her, too," he said, his voice filled with a cold fury. "He killed Isabella to silence her, to prevent her from revealing his treachery." A sudden noise from the staircase above interrupted them. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, were approaching. "We have to go," Marcello said, his voice urgent.
"Now."
They extinguished the torch, plunging the chamber back into darkness. They hurried up the stairs, their hearts pounding in unison. They were almost at the top when they heard a voice, cold and menacing, echoing down from above. "Going somewhere, Marcello?" It was Salvatore. He was standing at the top of the stairs, a cruel smile on his lips, a gun in his hand. And behind him, Alessia saw her brothers, bound and gagged, their faces bruised and bloodied. A glimmer of hope, now a fading ember. Chapter 9. The Weight of Unspoken Words. Salvatore's appearance, along with the sight of her captive brothers, struck Alessia like a physical blow. The glimmer of defiance that had been kindled within her flickered, threatened by a renewed surge of fear. She instinctively moved closer to Marcello, seeking the reassurance of his presence, the strength that emanated from him even in this desperate situation. "Salvatore," Marcello said, his voice calm and controlled, betraying none of the turmoil that Alessia knew he must be feeling. "Let them go. This is between you and me." Salvatore chuckled, a low, guttural sound that echoed down the staircase. "How touching, Marcello. You're concerned for your bride's family. But I'm afraid it's too late for that. They've seen too much. They know too much." He gestured with the gun towards Alessia's brothers. They were quite resistant at first, but a little persuasion, and they were more than willing to share their insights into your little conspiracy. Alessia's heart sank. She knew what persuasion meant in Salvatore's world. Torture, brutality, the breaking of bones and spirits. She looked at her brothers, their faces swollen and bloodied, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. "You're a coward, Salvatore," Alessia said, her voice trembling with anger. "You prey on the weak. You torture the innocent." Salvatore's smile widened. "Innocent? My dear Alessia, there are no innocents in this world. Only the strong and the weak. And your family, I'm afraid, has proven to be remarkably weak." He turned his attention back to Marcello. "As for you, cousin, you disappoint me. I always thought you were smarter than this. Digging up the past, playing detective with your little wife." He spat the word wife with a venomous disdain. "I know the truth, Salvatore," Marcello said, his voice unwavering. "I know you murdered my grandfather. I know you murdered Alessia's father. And I know you killed Isabella." Salvatore's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. But he quickly recovered, his composure returning. "You have no proof, Marcello. Just wild accusations, fueled by your sentimental attachment to the past." "I have Isabella's diary," Alessia said, stepping forward, her voice gaining strength. "She wrote about your plan, about your betrayal. She knew you were going to kill Giovanni." Salvatore's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Alessia. "The diary? You found it? I thought I had destroyed all traces of that meddling woman." "You missed one," Alessia said, her voice filled with a defiant pride. "And it will be your undoing." Salvatore laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "A diary? A few scribbled words from a dead woman? That's your proof, Marcello? That's what you're going to use to bring me down?" "It's enough," Marcello said, his voice cold and resolute. "It's enough to expose you for what you are. A murderer. A traitor." Salvatore shook his head, his smile returning. "You're delusional, Marcello. You're grasping at straws. You have nothing." He raised the gun, aiming it directly at Marcello. "It's over, cousin. Time to end this charade." Alessia gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She instinctively moved to shield Marcello, to place herself between him and the deadly weapon. But before she could move, before Salvatore could pull the trigger, a voice, clear and strong, echoed from the shadows behind him. "Drop the gun, Salvatore." Everyone turned, their eyes widening in surprise. Standing at the top of the staircase, silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor, was Aunt Sophia, Alessia's aunt, the woman who had raised her after her mother's death. She was holding a gun, her hand steady, her aim unwavering. Salvatore's face contorted with rage. "Sophia? How did you get out?" Sophia smiled, a cold, chilling smile that mirrored Salvatore's own. "You underestimate me, Salvatore. Just like you underestimated my niece. You thought we were weak, that we were easily manipulated. You were wrong." She stepped forward, her gun trained on Salvatore. "Drop the gun," I said, "or I will shoot you where you stand." Salvatore hesitated, his eyes darting between Sophia and Marcello. He was trapped, cornered. He had lost control of the situation. The weight of the unspoken words, the years of resentment, of hidden agendas, of carefully constructed lies, hung heavy in the air. The truth was out, exposed for all to see. And the consequences were about to unfold. The balance had shifted. Chapter 10. Echoes of Betrayal. The standoff in the stairwell was a tableau of frozen tension. Sophia, her face a mask of steely determination, held Salvatore at gunpoint. Marcello stood beside Alessia, his body shielding hers, his hand resting on the small of her back, a silent reassurance. Alessia's brothers, still bound and gagged, watched with a mixture of hope and fear in their bruised eyes. Salvatore, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief, slowly lowered his gun. He knew he was outmaneuvered, outmatched. But his pride, his arrogance, wouldn't allow him to surrender completely. "You think this changes anything, Sophia?" He sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can win? You're just a woman. You don't understand the rules of this game." Sophia's smile remained fixed, unwavering. "I understand more than you think, Salvatore. I've been watching you, listening to you, for years. I've seen your ambition, your greed, your cruelty. And I've been waiting for this moment." "Waiting for what?"
Salvatore scoffed.
"To betray your own family? To side with this outsider?" He gestured towards Marcello with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "I'm not betraying my family, Salvatore," Sophia said, her voice cold and resolute. "I'm protecting it."
"From you."
She took a step closer, her gun never wavering. "You murdered Antonio, didn't you? You framed Marcello's grandfather, just like Isabella's diary said. You used the old feud, the old hatreds, to cover your own tracks." Salvatore's eyes flickered, a flicker of guilt, of fear, crossing his face. But he quickly masked it, his expression hardening. "You have no proof," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have Isabella's diary," Alessia said, stepping forward. "And I have other evidence. Evidence that you overlooked." She reached into the pocket of her dress, pulling out a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was a box that had belonged to her father, a box he had always kept locked, a box she had never been allowed to open. "What's that?" Salvatore asked, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "This belonged to my father," Alessia said, her voice trembling slightly. "He kept it hidden, locked away. I never knew what was inside until now." She opened the box, revealing a collection of old letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the script was still legible. "These are letters," Alessia said, her voice gaining strength. "Letters between your father, Carlo, and my father, Antonio. Letters that reveal the truth." Salvatore's face paled. He recognized the handwriting, the familiar script of his own father. He knew in that moment that he was finished. Marcello took the letters from Alessia, his eyes scanning the contents. His face hardened, his jaw clenched with anger. "These letters, they confirm everything," he said, his voice filled with a cold fury. "They prove that your father, Carlo, was the one who betrayed my grandfather. He was the one who orchestrated his murder, working with Antonio to eliminate a common enemy."
"But why?"
Alessia asked, her voice filled with confusion. "Why would my father work with Carlo? They were supposed to be enemies." "They were rivals, yes," Marcello said, his voice bitter. "But they also shared a common goal. Control of the territory, control of the business. They formed a secret alliance, a pact to eliminate my grandfather and divide his empire between them." "But my father was murdered, too," Alessia said, her voice trembling. "By someone working for your family." "By Salvatore," Marcello said, his eyes fixed on his cousin. "He discovered the letters, the truth about his father's betrayal. He couldn't allow that truth to come out. It would have destroyed his family's legacy, his own claim to power." He turned to Salvatore, his voice a low growl. "You killed your own father, didn't you? You silenced him, just like you silenced Isabella, just like you tried to silence Alessia and me." Salvatore didn't answer. He simply stood there, his face a mask of defeat, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and despair. Sophia lowered her gun slightly, her hand trembling. "It's over, Salvatore," she said, her voice filled with a weary sadness. It's all over. The echoes of betrayal, of years of lies and deceit, hung heavy in the air. The truth had been revealed, but the cost had been high. Lives had been lost, families had been torn apart, and the scars of the past would linger for generations to come. The weight was almost unbearable. Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty. The aftermath of Salvatore's exposure was a whirlwind of activity. The loyal Ricci guards, alerted by Emilia and freed from their confinement, swiftly apprehended Salvatore and his men. Alessia's brothers, though battered and bruised, were released, their relief palpable. The mansion, once a suffocating cage, began to feel, if not safe, at least less menacing. The authorities were called in, a delicate dance between the famiglia and the official legal system, a dance Marcello navigated with a practiced ease born of years of operating in the gray areas between law and tradition. Salvatore's confession, extracted not through brutality, but through the undeniable weight of the evidence, sealed his fate. The letters found in Alessia's father's box, along with Isabella's diary, painted a clear picture of betrayal and conspiracy, a picture that implicated not only Salvatore, but also his father, Carlo. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Ricci and DeSantis families, shattering long-held beliefs and forcing a painful reckoning with the past. For Alessia, the days following the confrontation were a blur of emotions. Relief at her brother's release, gratitude towards Sophia for her courageous intervention, and a profound sadness for the lives lost, the betrayals uncovered. She found herself drawn to Marcello, seeking solace in his presence, in the quiet strength he offered. He, in turn, seemed to gravitate towards her, their shared ordeal forging a bond that transcended their initial animosity. He was no longer the cold, distant figure she had first encountered. He was vulnerable, human, a man grappling with the sins of his family, with the weight of his own responsibilities. One evening, they found themselves alone in the library, the room filled with the soft glow of lamplight, the scent of old books a comforting presence. Marcello was sitting in a leather armchair, his face etched with weariness, his eyes filled with a deep-seated sadness. Alessia sat opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer him comfort, but she hesitated, unsure of her place, unsure of the boundaries that still existed between them. "It's a heavy burden, isn't it?" she said softly, breaking the silence. "The weight of the past, the price of loyalty." Marcello looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. He nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding, of shared experience, passing between them. "It is," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Sometimes, I feel like I'm drowning in it. In the history, the secrets, the blood." He paused, his gaze shifting away from hers. "I never wanted this life, Alessia," he confessed. "I never wanted to be Don Ricci. I wanted something else. Something simpler." Alessia's heart ached for him. She saw, for the first time, the true cost of his position, the sacrifices he had made, the dreams he had been forced to abandon. "What did you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked back at her, a flicker of longing in his eyes. "I wanted to be an architect," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I wanted to build things, to create, not to destroy." The irony of his confession was not lost on Alessia. He was trapped in a world of destruction, a world of violence and betrayal, while his heart yearned for creation, for beauty, for peace. "It's not too late," she said, her voice filled with a sudden conviction. "You can still build. You can still create. You can create a new legacy. A legacy of peace, of justice, of hope." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw, in her gaze, not judgment, not pity, but understanding. And something more. Something that made his heart beat faster. Something that stirred a warmth within him that he had thought long extinguished. "Do you believe that, Alessia?" he asked, his voice hesitant, vulnerable. "I do," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I believe in you, Marcello. I believe in us." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was gentle, tentative, but it sent a shiver of electricity through her. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. "Just be." He squeezed her hand, his eyes holding hers. The silence that fell between them was not awkward, not strained, but comfortable. A silence filled with unspoken promises, with a shared hope for a future that was still uncertain, but that, for the first time, seemed possible. A future that could have a price. Chapter 12. A Dance with the Devil. Despite the resolution of Salvatore's threat, a sense of unease lingered in the air. The foundations of the Ricci family had been shaken, and the repercussions of the exposed betrayals were still being felt. Marcello, burdened by the weight of his responsibilities and the newly revealed truths about his family's past, threw himself into restructuring the famiglia, determined to steer it away from the darkness that had consumed it for so long. Alessia, no longer a prisoner, but not yet fully integrated into this new world, found herself navigating a complex landscape of shifting alliances and unspoken expectations. She was Marcello's wife, a position that afforded her a certain level of respect and protection, but she was also an outsider, a DeSantis, a reminder of the old feud, even though that feud had been exposed as a fabrication. One evening, a formal dinner was held at the mansion. It was ostensibly a gathering of the key members of the Ricci famiglia, a show of unity and strength in the wake of the recent turmoil. But Alessia sensed an undercurrent of tension, a subtle jockeying for power among the various factions. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant gown, her only adornment a delicate silver necklace that had belonged to her mother. She felt a pang of sadness, a longing for the familiar comfort of her old life, but she pushed it aside, determined to face this new challenge with courage and grace. Marcello, looking regal and imposing in a dark suit, greeted her with a warm smile, a flicker of genuine affection in his eyes. He offered her his arm, and they entered the dining room together. The room was filled with the murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the scent of expensive food and wine. Alessia recognized many of the faces, the men and women who controlled the various aspects of the Ricci Empire. Some greeted her with polite nods, others with veiled curiosity, their eyes assessing her, measuring her. She felt a hand on her arm, a light, possessive touch. It was Marcello, guiding her through the crowd, introducing her to the key players, his presence a silent reassurance, a shield against the unspoken scrutiny. They reached a table where a group of older men were gathered, their faces weathered and lined, their eyes sharp and calculating. These were the capo regimes, the lieutenants who controlled the various branches of the Ricci operations. Alessia, Marcello said, introducing her, "This is Don Giovanni's cousin, Riccardo. And these are his sons, Marco and Lorenzo." The men nodded curtly, their eyes assessing her. Riccardo, a man with a stern face and a piercing gaze, stepped forward. "Signora Ricci," he said, his voice gravelly. "We are pleased to finally make your acquaintance." His words were polite, but Alessia sensed a subtle challenge, an underlying skepticism. She met his gaze, her chin lifted. "The pleasure is mine, Don Riccardo," she said, her voice clear and steady. A flicker of surprise crossed Riccardo's face. He hadn't expected such composure, such confidence, from the DeSantis bride. The dinner proceeded, a carefully choreographed dance of power and politics. Alessia observed the interactions, the subtle nuances of conversation, the unspoken alliances and rivalries. She saw the way Marcello navigated the complex web of relationships, his words carefully chosen, his gestures deliberate. She also noticed the glances directed towards her, the whispers exchanged behind hands. She was an unknown quantity, a wild card in this intricate game. And she knew that she had to prove herself, not just to Marcello, but to the entire famiglia. She was not going to just be an accessory. Later, as the evening drew to a close, Marcello led her out onto the balcony, overlooking the moonlit gardens. The air was cool and refreshing, a welcome respite from the stifling atmosphere of the dining room. "You handled yourself well tonight, Alessia," Marcello said, his voice filled with admiration. You surprised them. You showed them that you are not to be underestimated. Alessia smiled, a flicker of pride warming her. I learned from the best, she said, her eyes meeting his. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver of pleasure down her spine. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. You are remarkable, Alessia, he said, his voice husky with emotion. You have brought light into this darkness. You have shown me a different way. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. It was no longer a tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration. It was a kiss filled with passion, with longing, with a growing affection that was undeniable. But as their lips met, a sudden noise from the gardens below interrupted them. A shadow moving in the darkness, a glint of metal reflecting the moonlight. Marcello pulled away, his hand instantly reaching for the gun he always carried concealed beneath his jacket. Stay here, he whispered, his eyes narrowed, his body tense and alert. He disappeared into the shadows, leaving Alessia alone on the balcony, her heart pounding with fear. She had thought the danger was over, that the threat had been eliminated. But she was wrong. The dance with the devil was not yet finished. It was just beginning. Chapter 13. Scars of the Heart. Alessia waited on the balcony, her heart hammering against her ribs, every rustle of leaves, every creak of the old house amplifying her fear. The romantic interlude with Marcello had been shattered, replaced by the familiar chill of danger, a stark reminder that peace in their world was always fragile, always fleeting. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She strained her ears, trying to decipher any sounds from the gardens below, but the night remained stubbornly silent, revealing nothing. The moon, a silent witness, cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and mock her anxiety. Finally, she heard footsteps, heavy and purposeful, approaching the balcony. She instinctively backed away, her hand reaching for anything she could use as a weapon, her mind racing through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Marcello emerged from the shadows, his face grim, his expression unreadable. He held a small, crumpled piece of paper in his hand. It was a warning, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He handed her the paper. Alessia unfolded it, her hands trembling. The message was short, crudely written, but its meaning was chillingly clear. The past is never truly buried. Blood will have blood. Alessia's breath caught in her throat. The threat was vague, but its implications were unmistakable. Someone, somewhere, was still seeking revenge, still clinging to the old hatreds, the old vendettas.
Who sent this?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcello shook his head. I don't know. It could be anyone. There are still factions loyal to Salvatore, remnants of the old regime who refuse to accept the new order. He paused, his eyes searching hers. Or it could be someone else. Someone with a deeper grudge, a more personal vendetta. Alessia's mind raced. She thought of Ricardo, of his sons, of the other Capo regimes she had met at dinner. Any one of them could be harboring secret resentments, hidden agendas. The web of intrigue within the Ricci family was far more complex, far more treacherous than she had ever imagined. We need to find out who sent this, she said, her voice gaining strength. We need to uncover the threat before it strikes again. Marcello nodded, his agreement evident. I'll increase security. Put my most trusted men on alert. We'll investigate every possible lead, every potential enemy. But even as he spoke, Alessia sensed a doubt, a fear that he couldn't quite conceal. The threat was not just external, it was also internal. The scars of the past, the wounds of betrayal, ran deep within the Ricci family, and they were not easily healed. Later that night, Alessia found herself unable to sleep. She lay in the large, opulent bed, her mind replaying the events of the evening, the chilling message, the lingering sense of unease. She felt Marcello stir beside her, his body tense and restless. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers tracing the outline of a scar that ran along his forearm, a physical reminder of the violence that had shaped his life. Marcelo, she whispered, her voice filled with concern. What is it? What's wrong? He turned to her, his eyes dark and troubled. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. It's my grandfather, he said, his voice barely audible. The letters Isabella's diary, they revealed the truth about his death, about Salvatore's betrayal. But they also revealed something else. Something about him. Something that shames me. Alessia's heart ached for him. She knew the weight of family secrets, the burden of inherited guilt. What is it, Marcelo? She asked gently. Tell me. He sighed, a deep, shuddering sigh. My grandfather, he was not the man I thought he was. He was ruthless, cruel. He used people, he betrayed them. He ordered the deaths of innocent men, women, even children. He paused, his voice choked with emotion. I carry his blood, Alessia. I carry his legacy. And I fear that I am no different. That I am destined to repeat his mistakes. Alessia reached out and took his face in her hands, her thumbs gently wiping away the tears that were streaming down his cheeks. You are not your grandfather, Marcelo, she said, her voice firm and resolute. You are a good man. You are trying to change things, to break the cycle of violence. You have a good heart. She leaned in and kissed him, a tender, compassionate kiss that conveyed all the unspoken emotions that she felt for him. It was a kiss of comfort, of reassurance, of love. A love that had blossomed in the darkness, a love that had grown amidst the danger and the betrayals. A love that was fragile, uncertain, but real. But that love was to leave a scar. Chapter 14. The Unraveling Truth. The days following the threatening note were filled with a renewed sense of urgency. Marcelo, driven by a combination of fear for Alessia's safety and a burning desire to eradicate the lingering shadows of the past, intensified his efforts to uncover the source of the threat. He interrogated his lieutenants, scrutinized old records, and even reached out to contacts within rival families, seeking any information that could shed light on the cryptic message. Alessia, meanwhile, found herself drawn back to the archives, to the whispers of the past that seemed to hold the key to the present danger. She spent hours poring over old documents, letters, and photographs, searching for any clue, any connection that might reveal the identity of their hidden enemy. She focused her attention on the period surrounding Isabella Rossi's death, convinced that the truth lay buried somewhere within the tangled web of relationships and rivalries that had defined that era. She reread Isabella's diary, analyzing every entry, every nuance of emotion, searching for a hidden meaning, a forgotten detail. One afternoon, while examining a collection of old photographs, she stumbled upon a picture she hadn't noticed before. It was a group portrait taken at a lavish party, years before Isabella's death. She recognized Marcelo's grandfather, Don Giovanni, standing in the center, surrounded by his closest associates. But it was another figure in the photograph that caught her attention. A young man, standing slightly apart from the group, his face partially obscured by shadow. He was wearing a distinctive ring on his left hand, a ring with a unique crest, a crest that Alessia had seen before. She gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She remembered where she had seen the crest. It was on a letter that had been among the documents Salvatore had tried to destroy. A letter that had been addressed to Riccardo, Don Giovanni's cousin. Alessia rushed to find Marcelo, her mind racing, the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fall into place. She found him in his study, his face etched with frustration, surrounded by stacks of papers and reports. Marcelo, she said breathlessly, holding out the photograph. I think I know who sent the threat. Marcelo took the photograph, his eyes scanning the image. He frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. Who is it, Alessia? He asked, his voice tense with anticipation. It's Riccardo, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and dread. Don Giovanni's cousin. I saw his ring. The crest, it matches a letter that Salvatore tried to destroy. A letter that implicated Riccardo in something. Marcelo's eyes widened in surprise. Riccardo? But he's always been loyal to the family. He helped us against Salvatore. He pretended to help us, Alessia corrected. He played the role of the loyal advisor, while secretly plotting against us. He's been manipulating us all along. Marcello's face hardened, his jaw clenched with anger.
But why?
What's his motive? I don't know, Alessia said, her voice trembling slightly. But I think it has something to do with Isabella Rossi.
With the past.
She showed Marcello the passage in Isabella's diary, the passage that mentioned Antonio DeSantis' plan, his alliance with someone within Giovanni's inner circle. I think Ricardo was that someone, Alessia said. I think he was working with Antonio, plotting to eliminate Giovanni and claim Isabella for himself. Marcello's eyes narrowed, his mind piecing together the fragments of information. It makes sense, he said slowly. Ricardo was always jealous of my grandfather, envious of his power, his women. He paused, his gaze fixed on Alessia. But why now? Why resurface after all these years? I don't know, Alessia said, her voice filled with uncertainty. Maybe he sees you as a threat. Maybe he wants to reclaim what he believes is rightfully his. The Ricci Empire. Marcello slammed his fist on the desk, his frustration evident. He won't get away with it, he said, his voice filled with a cold fury. I won't let him. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, was now unraveling, revealing a web of deceit and betrayal that stretched back generations. And the consequences were about to be devastating. Everything seemed to fall apart. Chapter 15. Flames of Rebellion. Marcello, armed with Alessia's discovery and fueled by a burning rage, wasted no time in confronting Ricardo. He summoned his cousin to the mansion, ostensibly for a routine meeting, but the atmosphere in the study was anything but routine. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of impending confrontation hanging heavy in the room. Alessia, though excluded from the meeting itself, waited anxiously in a nearby room, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She could hear the raised voices, the muffled accusations, the occasional thud of a fist against wood. She paced restlessly, her mind racing, imagining the scene unfolding behind the closed doors. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the door opened, and Marcello emerged, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Ricardo followed close behind, his expression defiant, his eyes filled with a cold, hard hatred. He denies it, of course, Marcello said, his voice tight with anger. He claims it's all a fabrication, a lie concocted by you, by me, to discredit him. But the photograph, the letter, Isabella's diary, Alessia protested, her voice filled with disbelief. It's all there. The evidence is clear. Evidence that can be dismissed, explained away, Ricardo said, his voice smooth and deceptively calm. A blurry photograph, a faded letter, the ramblings of a troubled woman. It's circumstantial, at best. He turned to Marcello, his eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake, cousin. You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. You're letting this outsider poison your mind. He spat the word outsider with a venomous disdain, his gaze fixed on Alessia. Alessia flinched, but she refused to back down. She met his gaze, her chin lifted. I am not an outsider, Ricardo, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I am Marcello's wife, and I will not stand by and watch you destroy his family, his legacy. Ricardo chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down Alessia's spine. Brave words, Signora Ricci, but empty threats. You have no power here. You are nothing. She is everything, Marcello said, his voice a low growl. He stepped forward, placing himself between Alessia and Ricardo, his body a protective shield. She is my wife, my partner, my strength, and you will not disrespect her. Ricardo's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. You've chosen your side then, cousin? You've chosen this woman over your own family, your own blood? I've chosen the truth, Marcello said, his voice unwavering. And the truth is you are a traitor, Ricardo. You betrayed my grandfather, you betrayed your family, and you will pay the price. Ricardo's eyes flickered, a flicker of fear crossing his face. But he quickly recovered, his composure returning. "You have no proof, Marcelo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't touch me." "We'll see about that," Marcelo said, his voice filled with a cold determination. He turned and walked away, leaving Ricardo standing there, his face a mask of suppressed rage. Alessia followed Marcelo, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was not the end, that this was just the beginning of a new, even more dangerous conflict. As they walked away, Alessia saw a glint in Ricardo's eyes, a flicker of something that sent a chill down her spine. He had underestimated them. She had underestimated him. That night, the mansion was engulfed in flames. Alessia awoke to the smell of smoke, the sound of crackling fire, the shouts of panicked servants. She scrambled out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw Marcelo, already dressed, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fury. "It's Ricardo," he said, his voice hoarse. He's set fire to the mansion. He's trying to destroy everything." They rushed outside, joining the chaotic scene of firefighters battling the blaze, servants desperately trying to salvage what they could. The flames leaped and danced, consuming the ancient stone walls, the priceless artwork, the memories that had been woven into the very fabric of the building. Alessia watched in horror, her heart breaking as she saw the symbol of the Ricci legacy, the embodiment of their power and history, reduced to ashes. She saw Marcelo standing beside her, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, his expression a mixture of grief and rage. The rebellion had begun, and the cost was going to be immeasurable. The fire was going to spread. Chapter 16. In the Lion's Denver. The fire at the mansion was a devastating blow, a symbolic attack on the very heart of the Ricci family. While the main structure was saved, thanks to the swift actions of the firefighters and Marcelo's loyal men, significant portions of the East Wing, including the archives, were destroyed. The loss of irreplaceable documents, family heirlooms, and historical records was a profound wound, a deliberate attempt by Ricardo to erase the past and cripple Marcelo's power. In the aftermath of the blaze, Marcelo, driven by a mixture of grief, rage, and a steely determination, made a bold decision. He decided to confront Ricardo directly, to enter the Lion's Den, Ricardo's heavily fortified estate, and demand a reckoning. Alessia, despite her fear for Marcelo's safety, insisted on accompanying him. She refused to be sidelined, to be treated as a fragile, protected object. She was his wife, his partner, and she would stand by his side, no matter the risk. "It's too dangerous, Alessia," Marcelo argued, his voice filled with concern. "Ricardo is unpredictable, ruthless. He won't hesitate to harm you." "I'm not afraid of him, Marcelo," Alessia said, her voice firm and resolute. "I'm stronger than he thinks, and I won't let you face him alone." Marcelo hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He saw the determination in her gaze, the unwavering loyalty, the love. He knew he couldn't dissuade her, that her spirit was as fiery and indomitable as the flames that had consumed their home. He nodded, his agreement silent, but profound. "All right," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "We go together." They traveled to Ricardo's estate under the cover of darkness, accompanied by a small, heavily armed escort of Marcelo's most trusted men. The estate was a fortress, surrounded by high walls, guarded by armed sentries, a clear indication of Ricardo's paranoia and his preparations for a violent confrontation. Marcelo, using his authority and a carefully crafted blend of threats and promises, managed to gain entry, demanding a face-to-face meeting with Ricardo. Alessia, her heart pounding in her chest, stood by his side, her presence a silent statement of defiance, a challenge to Ricardo's authority. They were led into a lavishly decorated study, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigars and old leather. Ricardo was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, his face a mask of cold arrogance, his eyes filled with a simmering hatred. "Marcelo," Ricardo said, his voice smooth and deceptively calm. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "You know why I'm here," Ricardo, Marcello said, his voice a low growl. The fire, the threats, the attempted murder. Ricardo chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that echoed in the room. You have no proof, cousin. Just wild accusations, fueled by your wife's paranoia. Alessia stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. We have proof, Ricardo. Isabella's diary, the letters, the photograph, and your own actions speak for themselves. Ricardo's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. You're playing a dangerous game, Signora Ricci. A game you cannot win. We're not playing a game, Ricardo, Marcello said, his voice unwavering. We're seeking justice. For my grandfather, for Alessia's father, for all those you've harmed. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed. Justice? There is no justice in this world, Marcello. Only power. And I have the power. He gestured towards the armed guards standing at the perimeter of the room. You're surrounded, cousin. You're outnumbered. You're trapped. Marcello smiled, a cold, chilling smile that mirrored Ricardo's own. You think you have me trapped, Ricardo? You think you've won? He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, silver device. It was a detonator. Ricardo's eyes widened in surprise, then in fear. What is that? He stammered. This, Marcello said, his voice calm and deliberate, is insurance. My men have planted explosives throughout your estate, Ricardo. Enough to level this entire place to the ground. He held up the detonator, his finger hovering over the button. One press, and it all goes up in flames. You, your men, your legacy. Everything. Ricardo's face paled. He was trapped, cornered, his own arrogance, his own belief in his invincibility, turned against him. He had underestimated Marcello, underestimated Alessia, underestimated the lengths they would go to seek justice, to protect their family. The lion's den had become a trap, and the hunter had become the hunted. Alessia was the bait. Chapter 17. A shattered reflection. The standoff in Ricardo's study hung precariously, the air thick with the threat of imminent destruction. Ricardo, his face ashen, his bravado shattered, stared at the detonator in Marcello's hand, his mind racing, desperately searching for a way out of the trap he had so carelessly walked into. Alessia stood beside Marcello, her body rigid with tension, her eyes fixed on Ricardo, watching for any sign of deception, any attempt to regain control. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and exhilaration, a sense of empowerment that came from facing down a formidable enemy, from standing shoulder to shoulder with the man she loved. You're bluffing, Marcello, Ricardo said, his voice trembling slightly, betraying his fear. You wouldn't do it. You wouldn't destroy your own family, your own history. Marcello's smile remained fixed, unwavering. You underestimate me, cousin. Just like you underestimated my grandfather, just like you underestimated Alessia. I am not afraid to destroy, to rebuild, to create a new legacy, free from the taint of your treachery. He took a step closer, his finger hovering over the button. Tell me, Ricardo, he said, his voice low and menacing. Tell me everything. Tell me about Isabella, about my grandfather, about your pact with Antonio DeSantis. Ricardo hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape route, a way to salvage the situation. But there was none. He was trapped, cornered, his fate hanging in the balance. Finally, he slumped back in his chair, his shoulders sagging, his defiance crumbling. All right, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I'll tell you everything. He began to speak, his voice filled with a mixture of bitterness and regret, recounting the events of the past, the secrets that had been buried for so long. He confessed his love for Isabella, his jealousy of Giovanni, his secret alliance with Antonio DeSantis, their plan to eliminate Giovanni and divide his empire between them. But Antonio betrayed me, Ricardo said, his voice choked with emotion. He used me just like he used everyone. He never intended to share power. He wanted it all for himself. He paused, his gaze shifting to Alessia. And your father, he was no saint, Signora Ricci. He was just as ruthless, just as ambitious as any of us. He was willing to sacrifice anyone, anything, to achieve his goals. Alessia felt a wave of nausea, a bitter taste in her mouth. The truth was ugly, painful, a stark contrast to the idealized image she had held of her father, of her family. After Giovanni's death, Riccardo continued, I tried to forget. I tried to move on. But the past, it wouldn't let me go. It haunted me, tormented me. He looked at Marcello, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. When I saw you, Marcello, when I saw you rising to power, I saw him. I saw Giovanni. And I couldn't bear it. I had to stop you. Marcello listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He felt a mixture of anger, of pity, of understanding. He saw, in Riccardo, a broken man, a man consumed by his past, a man trapped in a cycle of violence and betrayal. And the fire? Alessia asked, her voice trembling slightly. Why did you set fire to the mansion? Riccardo's eyes flickered. I wanted to destroy the archives, he said. I wanted to erase the past, to prevent the truth from ever coming out. But you failed, Alessia said, her voice gaining strength. The truth always finds a way. It always resurfaces. Riccardo looked at her, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. Perhaps you're right, he said softly. A silence fell over the room, a silence broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a stark reminder of the passage of time, of the inevitability of consequences. Marcello lowered the detonator, his hand relaxing slightly. He had won. He had exposed Riccardo. He had uncovered the truth. He had avenged his grandfather, his family. But the victory felt hollow, empty. The cost had been high, the scars too deep. He looked at Alessia, her face pale but resolute, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. He knew that their journey was far from over, that the rebuilding process would be long and arduous. But he also knew that they would face it together, that their love, their bond, would be their strength, their guiding light in the darkness. The mirror was broken. Chapter 18. The Reckoning. The immediate threat posed by Riccardo was neutralized, but the fallout from his confession and attempted destruction lingered like a persistent, acrid smoke. Marcello, with a heavy heart but unwavering resolve, handed Riccardo over to the authorities, a decision that sent ripples of shock and disbelief through the extended famiglia. It was a necessary act, a clear signal that the old ways, the tolerance for internal betrayal and violence, were over. The legal proceedings were complex and protracted, a delicate dance between the formal justice system and the unwritten codes of the mafia. Marcello navigated this treacherous landscape with the help of his most trusted advisors, ensuring that Riccardo faced the consequences of his actions while also protecting the core interests of the Ricci family. Alessia, while supportive of Marcello's decisions, found herself grappling with the emotional turmoil stirred up by Riccardo's revelations. The idealized image she had held of her father, of her family's history, had been shattered, replaced by a harsh and unsettling reality. She struggled to reconcile the loving, protective father she remembered with the ruthless, ambitious man described in Riccardo's confession and the historical documents. She sought solace in Marcello's presence, in his quiet strength and unwavering support. He, in turn, found comfort in her understanding, her empathy, her ability to see beyond the darkness, to find the glimmer of hope amidst the ruins. One evening, they found themselves walking through the damaged east wing of the mansion, the charred remnants of the fire a stark reminder of Riccardo's destructive rage. The air was still tinged with the smell of smoke, a lingering ghost of the past. It's hard, Alessia said softly, her voice filled with a weary sadness. To accept that the people we loved, the people we admired, were capable of such things. Marcello nodded, his expression grim. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. It is, he agreed. But we cannot change the past, Alessia. We can only learn from it. We can only strive to be better. To break the cycle. He paused, his gaze fixed on the damaged walls, the blackened timbers. "I spent so long trying to live up to my grandfather's legacy," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I thought I had to be ruthless, powerful, feared. I thought that was the only way to protect my family." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "But you showed me a different way, Alessia. You showed me that strength can come from compassion, from love, from forgiveness." Alessia squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. She saw, in his eyes, the weight of his burden, the struggle he faced in reconciling his past with his desire for a different future. "We'll build a new legacy, Marcelo," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "A legacy of justice, of peace, of hope. Together." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that warmed her heart. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, loving kiss that conveyed all the unspoken emotions that flowed between them. But even as they embraced, Alessia sensed a lingering unease, a feeling that the reckoning was not yet complete, that there were still secrets to be uncovered, still wounds to be healed. The next day brought a new revelation, a twist in the narrative that neither of them had anticipated. A package arrived at the mansion, addressed to Alessia. It was a small, wooden box, unmarked, with no indication of the sender. Alessia, her heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, opened the box. Inside, she found a single object, a gold locket, intricately carved, with a familiar crest, a crest she had seen before. The crest of Isabella Rossi. She opened the locket, revealing a miniature portrait of Isabella, her beautiful face staring back at her, a haunting reminder of the past. And on the back of the portrait, a small inscription, barely legible, but clear enough to send a chill down Alessia's spine. "The sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children." Alessia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She knew, in that moment, that the reckoning was far from over, that the past, like a vengeful ghost, was still reaching out, seeking to claim its due. The balance was still broken. Chapter 19. Threads of Redemption. The arrival of Isabella Rossi's locket, with its ominous inscription, cast a new shadow of uncertainty over Alessia and Marcelo. The past, seemingly laid to rest with Ricardo's confession and imprisonment, had resurfaced, raising new questions, new fears.
"Who sent this?"
Alessia asked, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes fixed on the locket, on Isabella's hauntingly beautiful face. Marcelo, his expression grim, examined the box, searching for any clue, any indication of the sender's identity. But there was nothing. It was as if the package had appeared out of thin air, a ghost from the past materializing in their present. "I don't know," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "It could be anyone. Someone still loyal to Ricardo, someone seeking revenge, someone with a deeper connection to Isabella." He paused, his gaze shifting to the inscription on the back of the locket. "The sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children." This changes things, Alessia," he said, his voice heavy with a sense of foreboding. "It suggests that there's more to the story. That Ricardo wasn't the only one involved. That there's someone else out there, someone who still believes in the old vendettas, the old hatreds." Alessia felt a chill run down her spine. The inscription seemed to imply a threat, not just to them, but to their future, to any children they might have. It was a curse, a legacy of violence and betrayal that seemed to stretch across generations. "We need to find out who sent this," she said, her voice gaining strength, her determination fueled by a fierce protective instinct. "We need to uncover the truth, once and for all. We need to break the cycle." Marcelo nodded, his agreement silent but profound. He knew that they could not rest, that they could not find peace, until they had unraveled the remaining mysteries of the past, until they had confronted the ghosts that still haunted their present. They decided to return to the source, to the few remaining documents that had survived the fire in the archives. They spent days poring over old letters, diaries, and records, searching for any clue, any connection to Isabella Rossi, to the inscription on the locket. And then they found it. A hidden compartment in Isabella's diary, a compartment that had been overlooked in their previous searches. Inside, they found a single letter, addressed to Isabella but never sent. The letter was from Giovanni Ricci, Marcello's grandfather. Alessia and Marcello read the letter together, their hearts pounding in unison. The words, written in Giovanni's elegant script, revealed a truth that neither of them had anticipated, a truth that shattered their assumptions, their understanding of the past. Giovanni confessed his love for Isabella, his regret for the pain he had caused her, for the conflict that had erupted between him and Antonio DeSantis. But he also revealed something else, something far more shocking. He revealed that Isabella had been pregnant with his child. Alessia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcello's face paled, his eyes widening in disbelief. The letter continued, Giovanni expressing his fear for Isabella's safety, his concern that Antonio would harm her, would harm their unborn child. He wrote of a plan, a desperate attempt to protect them, to send them away, to a safe haven, far from the reach of Antonio's vengeance. But the letter ended abruptly, unfinished, as if Giovanni had been interrupted, as if he had never had the chance to complete his plan. Alessia and Marcello looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and understanding. The inscription on the locket, "The sins of the father shall be visited upon the children," took on a new, chilling meaning. It wasn't a curse, it was a warning. A warning from Giovanni, a desperate attempt to protect his child, his heir, from the consequences of his actions, from the vendetta that had consumed his life. And that child, that heir, was still out there, somewhere. A thread of hope, of redemption, began to weave its way into the tapestry of their lives. But it was a thread that was still fragile, still vulnerable, still threatened by the shadows of the past. The children were about to arrive. Chapter 20. A New Dawn. The revelation of Isabella Rossi's pregnancy and Giovanni Ricci's desperate attempt to protect their unborn child sent Alessia and Marcello on a frantic search, a quest to uncover the fate of that child, to find the missing heir to the Ricci legacy. They followed a trail of cryptic clues, scattered across old documents, hidden messages, and whispered rumors. They traveled to remote villages, interviewed elderly relatives, and consulted with historians and archivists, piecing together the fragments of a story that had been buried for decades. Their search led them to a small, secluded convent, nestled high in the Sicilian mountains, a place of peace and contemplation, far removed from the violence and intrigue of the mafia world. There, they met an elderly nun, Sister Angelica, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a woman who held the key to the mystery. Sister Angelica, after much persuasion and a heartfelt plea from Alessia, revealed the truth. Isabella Rossi had indeed sought refuge in the convent many years ago, pregnant and fearing for her life. She had given birth to a son, a healthy, beautiful boy, whom she had named Angelo. But Isabella had not stayed at the convent. She had feared that Antonio DeSantis would find her, would harm her child. She had entrusted Angelo to the care of the nuns, promising to return for him when it was safe. But she had never returned. Alessia and Marcello listened in stunned silence, their hearts aching for Isabella, for the child she had been forced to abandon, for the life that had been lost. What would happen to Angelo? Alessia asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Sister Angelica smiled, a sad, wistful smile. He grew up here in the convent, she said. He was a bright, curious boy, full of life, full of hope. She paused, her gaze shifting to a distant memory. But he always yearned for his mother, for his family. He knew he was different, that he had a destiny beyond these walls. Did he ever learn the truth about his parents? Marcello asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Sister Angelica nodded. When he was old enough, we told him everything. We showed him Isabella's diary, Giovanni's letter. We told him about his family, about the dangers he faced. And what did he do? Alessia asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Sister Angelica's smile widened. He left, she said. He left the convent, determined to find his place in the world. To reclaim his legacy. Do you know where he is now? Marcello asked, his voice filled with a desperate hope. Sister Angelica hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and pride. He changed his name, she said. He wanted to protect himself, to distance himself from the violence of his family's past. She paused, her gaze meeting Alessia's, then Marcello's. He calls himself Luca Mancini, she said. And he is a lawyer. A successful, respected lawyer, working to fight injustice, to help those in need. Alessia and Marcello exchanged a look of shock, of disbelief, of relief. They had found him. They had found Giovanni's heir, Isabella's son. And he was alive.
And well.
And fighting for good. The new dawn had arrived, a dawn of hope, of redemption, of a future free from the shadows of the past. The cycle of violence and betrayal had been broken, replaced by a new legacy, a legacy of justice, of compassion, of love. Alessia felt tears streaming down, tears of joy. She had found her family.
The sins were absolved.
The final confrontation, the final piece of the puzzle had been resolved. Not with violence, not with bloodshed, but with revelation, with truth, with forgiveness. The sun rose. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Ricci estate had been rebuilt, not as a fortress of power and intimidation, but as a home, a place of warmth, laughter, and love. The scars of the fire had faded, replaced by new growth, new life, a symbol of the transformation that had taken place within the family, within Alessia and Marcello themselves. They stood on the balcony, overlooking the sprawling gardens, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Alessia held their 3-year-old daughter, Isabella, in her arms, while Marcello wrapped his arm around their 5-year-old son, Giovanni, who was excitedly pointing at a flock of birds flying overhead. The children were a testament to their love, to their resilience, to their determination to build a different future, a future free from the shadows of the past. They were a blend of both their families, carrying the best qualities of the Ricci and DeSantis lineages, without the burden of the old hatreds, the old vendettas. Luca Mancini, now a close friend and trusted advisor, visited often, his presence a constant reminder of the interconnectedness of their lives, of the power of forgiveness and redemption. He had embraced his heritage, not as a burden, but as a source of strength, a motivation to continue his work fighting for justice, for equality, for a better world. The Famiglia had been transformed as well. Under Marcello's leadership, guided by Alessia's wisdom and compassion, it had shifted its focus, moving away from violence and intimidation towards legitimate businesses, towards community development, towards creating opportunities for those who had been marginalized and oppressed. The old guard, those who had clung to the old ways, had either retired, been exiled, or, in a few rare cases, adapted to the new order. The Ricci name, once synonymous with fear and respect, was now associated with hope, with change. Alessia looked at Marcello, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. He had become the man she had always believed he could be, a man of strength, of compassion, of integrity. He had shed the weight of his family's past, embracing a future filled with promise, with possibility. He smiled at her, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that conveyed all the unspoken emotions that flowed between them. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, loving kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment to each other, to their family, to their new legacy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gardens, Alessia held her children close, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace, of contentment. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with danger, betrayal, and loss. But they had survived. They had overcome. They had found their way, together. The scent of roses, no longer tainted by blood, filled the air, a sweet, fragrant reminder of the beauty that could bloom even in the darkest of times. The vow in chains had become a vow of love, a vow of hope, a vow of forever. And above them, the stars appeared as Alessia looked and whispered to her little ones. The stars are watching and they approve. They had created their own constellation.